timeout.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Kenny, and welcome to ESPN Classic's Top 5 Reasons You Can't Blame, a series that takes a fresh look at sports personalities who are remembered largely for their mistakes, controversial moments, or questionable decisions. It's been called one of the most traumatic events for New Yorkers since World War II. The announcement in 1957 that the Dodgers would move from Brooklyn to Los Angeles still spikes the blood pressure of those old enough to remember. Only 2 years removed from winning their only World Series championship, the Dodgers deserted their largely working-class fans for the untapped market of Southern California. For such treason, Walter O'Malley has been branded one of the biggest villains of sports ownership. Before we count down the top 5 reasons...
Baseball was America in the 40s and 50s. And in Brooklyn, the way people's value system was in those days is number 1 was the Brooklyn Dodgers, number 2 might be family, and number 3 might be school or anything else.
Whenever they say, where were you born? I said, I was born in Los Angeles, but baseball-wise, I was born in Brooklyn.
Baseball of Brooklyn was the heart and soul of Brooklyn. To me, it was a love affair. They loved this team.
We came back to the same neighborhoods year after year. So we got to know the deli guy, the barber. We sort of became part of the family of Brooklyn.
It was a bond that endured the best and worst of times. Over 2 decades that began in 1921, the Dodgers posted 12 losing seasons and not a single pennant. Yet the family of fan and team held together.
What's Brooklyn got that no other city's got?
What's Brooklyn got? The Dodgers.
My family struggled. For me, it made the Dodgers the easiest team to understand. A bunch of people who tried, who struggled, and usually lost in the end.
Although Brooklyn competed in its 3rd World Series in 1941, the franchise had yet to win a championship. Then in 1947, something vastly more significant than a world title occurred in the blue-collar borough. On April 15th, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier.
We didn't know that he was changing America. That when that team was formed, and its engine in many ways emotionally was Robinson. For a lot of people my age, there was no other team.
It became a rallying point for equality, for representing what America is supposed to be all about. And if you were a kid growing up, the Dodgers had that kind of special aura.
While the Dodgers won pennants in 1947 and 1949, President and General Manager Branch Rickey was losing ground to co-owner Walter O'Malley. And in 1950, the man who signed Jackie Robinson was pushed out of power. Rumblings of discontent could be heard from Canarsie to Greenpoint.
O'Malley was the guy who got rid of Branch Rickey. And Branch Rickey was God in my household.
If you're calling Central Casting and say, send me a guy that people are going to despise on sight, they're going to send you something very much like Walter O'Malley.
He's a bankruptcy lawyer during the Depression, a grave dancer. He's making money when people are selling apples.
With O'Malley at the wheel, the team that Rickey built continued an era of prosperity and victory, winning 2 more pennants in 1952 and 53. But with each pennant came a loss to the hated Bronx Bombers, who had beaten them in 5 World Series since 1941. Wait till next year was the borough's credo.
You got to get up in life, because a lot of things are going to knock you down. The Dodgers kept getting up. What rooting for the Dodgers gave all of us who did root for the Dodgers, a respect for imperfection. We learned how to lose.
Deliverance arrived in 1955 when left-hander Johnny Padres went the distance in Game 7.
The Dodgers win it 2-0 and win their first World Series. They were out-hit by a gallant Yankee team, but never outplayed, and this day will live long in the memory of Brooklyn, USA.
I still say it's the happiest day of my life, but what it took to get to that moment was agonizing.
Brooklyn went wild when we won that.
The street was just packed with people. I remember players going out to wave it to people. It was something to see.
While Brooklyn fans glowed with pride, O'Malley was considering the future. He wanted a new home for his team, but it wasn't clear exactly where home would be. While Gotham fiddled, L.A. let it be known that it lusted after a major league franchise. Suspense built over the next 2 seasons.
Do you feel now that there's a good chance that your club is going to stay here in New York?
Gabe, honestly, I haven't the vaguest idea at this moment. We know that we have a fine proposition from Los Angeles, a sincere one.
Horace Stoneham announced in August that the Giants were leaving for San Francisco, and the fans knew it. It was a foregone conclusion that Brooklyn was going to move out too. But O'Malley wanted to get every nickel he could out of those fans till the last day. And as soon as the season was over, then he announced that Brooklyn was going to Los Angeles.
The deed was done October 8th, 1957.
My ball club was the thing I loved the most, even more than my parents. So to take this away from me, I took it very personally. There was an extraordinary feeling of betrayal.
If O'Malley walked down the street, somebody probably would have punched him out, or he maybe even shot him. Who knows? I mean, they hated him.
We felt, why not just build a team? Why take our team? You know, go down, buy your own car. Don't take my car. There's an emotional legacy that O'Malley left, which is a generalized cynicism about sports. You know, to just go where the money was. The sort of mysterious connection to sports was, I think, broken forever by O'Malley.
That's the conventional wisdom behind the vilification of O'Malley. In a few minutes, we'll make our case by counting down the top 5 reasons you can't blame him for uprooting the Dodgers. But first, here are a few that didn't make the cut. We call them the best of the rest. Phil Wrigley. The owner of the Chicago Cubs held the key to the Los Angeles market. And in 1957, O'Malley picked the lock.
O'Malley had the Fort Worth territory for a farm team. The Cubs had Los Angeles. And at a baseball writers' dinner in New York, he swapped Fort Worth for Los Angeles.
The Los Angeles territory is worth, hundreds of millions of dollars today. I mean, what were they thinking? But then again, that's the Cubs.
Our other best of the rest, Horace Stoneham. Plagued by poor attendance and a dilapidated canyon of a ballpark, the New York Giants owner was ready to move his team to Minneapolis until he considered the profit potential of a Giants-Dodgers rivalry on the West Coast.
There was a question as to whether the National League would have approved one team moving to the West Coast.
Remember now, we're talking about an era where commercial aviation is really just taking off. And by having the Giants go out there, too, meant that they can play in 2 different venues for their 2,000-mile flight.
Horace Greeley. If the editor of the New York Tribune didn't actually come up with the phrase often attributed to him, "Go west, young man," he certainly was a passionate proponent of westward expansion. Until the Giants and Dodgers shook loose from their eastern roots, not one of the 16 Major League franchises played west of Kansas City.
Los Angeles and San Francisco, with no Major League Baseball, were underserved markets.
Walter O'Malley did baseball a huge favor by making us a continental national pastime for a continental nation.
Almost the same instincts that impelled the gold rushers to go out to San Francisco area in the mid-1800s impelled Walter O'Malley to seek the Southern California area, so there was an opportunity to make an awful lot of money out there.
There's a great picture of O'Malley coming out to Los Angeles and seeing Chavez Ravine. And like Brigham Young, he goes, that's the place. He sees a ballpark.
We found a site, we spent a great deal of money, and we built a magnificent ballpark, and the people love it.
The move west was validated before the completion of Dodger Stadium in 1962. 4 years earlier, in their inaugural season at the LA Coliseum, the Dodgers drew 1 million by July, passing Brooklyn's home attendance for the previous season. In 1959, they passed 2 million, and 19 years later, the Dodgers were the first franchise to draw 3 million.
Los Angeles made good on Horace Greeley's advice to go west. Sooner or later, somebody had to go west. For Walter O'Malley, it was an offer he couldn't refuse.
1 down, 4 to go. Here is reason number 4. William Levitt. The New York real estate developer revolutionized home construction and spurred a massive flight from the city to the suburbs in the 1950s.
Levitt was a guy who began to build houses on the cheap. He makes it possible for an entire generation of New Yorkers to move out to the suburbs.
End of the Second World War, we demobilized 12 million people. Government passes GI Bill of Rights, and they said, we will subsidize your mortgage. Well, lo and behold, the result is Long Island. It's Levittown.
The flight to the suburbs was just one factor in the evolution of Brooklyn. The borough's daily paper, the Brooklyn Eagle, folded in 1955, and the famed Navy Yard continued to lose contracts to other ports.
I think O'Malley was definitely upset by the changing complexion of Brooklyn. Part of that was racial. What he was seeing as Brooklyn changed was middle-class whites being replaced by poor minorities.
Fewer suburbanites were willing to travel back into the deteriorating areas around Ebbets Field. Even in that championship season of 1955, average attendance was less than half of the park's capacity.
There was urban blight. There was no parking at Ebbets Field. It was a very difficult chore to get there by car and park your car and come back and find that the tires had not been slashed or the paint had not been scratched.
There was an element of safety and an element of fear. So all of that contributed to the Dodgers wanting to get out of Ebbets Field.
A brave new world. The Braves started it. Their relocation from Boston to Milwaukee in 1953 was the first shift of franchises in half a century.
Milwaukee rolls out the red carpet for its new baseball team, the Braves. Owner Lou Perini says Boston was never like this.
I think everyone in baseball saw the wide acceptance by the Braves in Wisconsin. That got the attention of everyone in baseball.
It really let loose the forces that really created modern baseball. Because the year after the Braves moved, you had the St. Louis Browns move to Baltimore and become the Orioles. The following year, the Philadelphia Athletics moved to Kansas City. And then, following the 1957 season, the Dodgers and Giants both moved out of New York.
If O'Malley took notice when Milwaukee successfully lured Lou Perini with the promise of a new ballpark, he must have been jolted out of his chair when the attendance numbers rolled in. The Braves' total 1952 home attendance in Boston was surpassed in Milwaukee's first 13 games.
Milwaukee was drawing 2 million people, and we were lucky to draw 1 million. And he used them as an example. It was a financial reason. There's no doubt about it. No, I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of. It was finances.
The Braves move to Milwaukee is critical in O'Malley's thinking because prior to that, replacing Ebbets Field was an idea. After the Braves move, it's a necessity.
Have we begun to change your mind yet? If not, take a look at reason number 2. I love L.A. Los Angeles officials made O'Malley an offer he couldn't refuse. Compliments of the youngest member of the city council.
I ran for office in 1953, and I thought it would be a very good issue. So I checked off on my little 3x5 card, bring Major League Baseball to Los Angeles.
Preferring to make a deal in New York, O'Malley balked at Rosalind Wyman's initial inquiry in 1955. But at the 1956 World Series in Brooklyn, an L.A. County supervisor, Kenneth Hahn, came calling.
He is so desperate for a team that he'll take the Washington Senators. O'Malley sees him talking to the owner of the Senators, looking down from his box at Ebbets Field. He writes down on a napkin, "Don't do anything until you talk to me." Hands it to an usher, hands it to Hahn.
The Dodgers stopped in Los Angeles after the World Series in 1956 on their way to Japan, and Kenny Hahn takes O'Malley up in a helicopter. and he shows O'Malley this land at Chavez Ravine.
And Walter understood by looking at that you could use that contour of that land for a possible stadium. Then he showed some interest.
With the city council set to offer O'Malley's 300 acres of prime real estate, Mayor Norris Paulson asked Wyman to get a commitment from the Dodgers owner.
I said, Mr. O'Malley, we'd really like to know whether you will come if this vote is taken. And he said to me, I'm a New Yorker, and I would rather stay in New York if I can.
Rosalind Wyman hangs up the phone, walks back down the hallway to the mayor's office. Norris Paulson says, what happened? She says, I couldn't reach him.
I felt if I had to give the answer that he had given to me, we were dead.
The LA City Council votes to offer him everything he could have ever imagined. New York offers nothing, and he leaves.
Well, if somebody offered you 300 acres in LA, what would you do? If I want O'Malley, I'd do it tomorrow. Absolutely.
LA totally outmaneuvered New York. They made O'Malley an offer that only a fool would have refused.
And welcome back. You've now seen reasons 5 through 2 why O'Malley isn't to blame for the most controversial franchise move in sports history. Forgive us, Brooklyn, but here it is. Reason number 1. Holy Moses.
Don't blame O'Malley. You better blame Moses. And that's not the Moses that parted the sea.
Blame this Moses, Robert Moses. New York's most powerful public figure for much of the 20th century, thwarted O'Malley's plan to build a new stadium in Brooklyn. Since the Depression, no major public construction project was undertaken in the Big Apple without Moses' approval.
Robert Moses was never elected to anything. He had 12 different jobs at once. He was the city park commissioner, the state park commissioner, the slum clearance commissioner, the city construction coordinator. He had more power than any mayor or any governor combined.
O'Malley needed to curry favor with Moses if he was to replace the antiquated Ebbets Field. In 1953, he envisioned a privately financed dome stadium at the corner of Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues.
All the subways came there together with the Long Island Railroad so that people could come in from Nassau County, Suffolk County, as well as you could get there on any subway in the city of New York.
It's perfect. 2 major avenues run by it. So he sits down and very carefully writes a letter to Robert Moses. He goes, you condemn the land, I'll buy it at a reduced rate, and I'll build a ballpark.
But when you talked about the city's power to condemn, you were talking about Robert Moses' power, and he wouldn't hear of it.
4 days later, Moses rejected O'Malley's stadium proposal, claiming he was bound by law to only use his condemnation powers for a public project. Yet O'Malley persisted, knowing full well that Moses had cleared many a neighborhood for private developers. A battle of egos ensued.
Moses doesn't like Walter O'Malley, not even a little.
With everything about Moses, there's always the political, the rational, and the personal. The idea that O'Malley had different ideas, Moses wasn't going to listen to them just because they were different.
The biggest disappointment of his life was when his dream to build the Dome Stadium downtown did not happen. Only when that was proven to be politically impossible did he then look elsewhere.
To underscore his threat to move the Dodgers, O'Malley scheduled 7 home games in Jersey City for the 1956 and 57 seasons. Moses responded by offering to build O'Malley a municipal stadium, not in Brooklyn, but in Queens.
Moses wanted to build the park where the Shea Stadium is built today. And Mr. O'Malley says, hey, we're not the New York Dodgers. We are the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Could you imagine George Steinbrenner taking the Yankees out of New York? Certainly not. I think the mayor and Robert Moses could not perceive of O'Malley moving and lowballed the offer.
I think if Moses had come in literally in the last hour and said, all right, we'll assemble it at Atlantic and Flatbush, you can buy it, I think O'Malley would have jumped at that.
Moses thought he was bluffing. He not only left, but he took the Giants with him.
I think O'Malley's frustration in dealing with Moses just grew and grew to the point where he was susceptible to this romance that the LA people were putting on him.
O'Malley wanted to keep the Dodgers in Brooklyn, but he ran into the one man who could stop all of this. His name was Robert Moses.
Well, there you have it, the top 5 reasons you can't blame O'Malley for moving the Dodgers to L.A. Perhaps after all these years, we've helped soothe Brooklyn's sense of abandonment. I'm Brian Kenny. Thanks for watching.